In this video, we're going to look at how to create flounces, and then I'm going to show you how to insert them into your shirt. This one I've inserted in using the button stand. A flounce is different to a ruffle in as much as it's flat at the point of the seam line, whereas a ruffle would be gathered. To create a flounce, we create them out of circles, so either a full circle or a semicircle. So that's a semicircle, and then a full circle looks like this. Now what's important is the length that you want your flounce to be, and that length is actually going to be the length of your inner circle. So in order to mark out our circles for this flounce, we need to know that length. We also need to know what the radius of this inner circle is going to be. So if you have a circle like this, if you take a line from one end to the other, that's your diameter, and half of that diameter is your radius, and it is that radius that we need to know. In order to do that, there's a formula that you apply to find out how to create that flounce. This formula I'm going to show you is the same formula for any length. So whether your flounce is actually going to be 10 centimetres long, or 5 centimetres long, or 15 centimetres long, it doesn't matter, the formula should be the same. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the length of my flounce. So this flounce is in fact 30 centimetres. So it's 30 centimetres I'm going to base my measurements on to show you how to make the flounce. I'm just going to now move my camera just slightly so that hopefully you can see more easily how I'm going to mark this out. Okay, so as I said, there's a specific formula to creating your circles for your flounces. And it's as follows. So if you want to make a half circle, you take your length, so in my case that was 30 centimetres, and I'm going to divide that by 3.14. And that will give me the radius for a half circle. So for my 30 centimetres, if I divide that by 3.14, it gives me 9.6 centimetres. Well, in fact, it actually gives me 9.5 and lots of different numbers. So if that's the case on your calculation, just round it up. So I've rounded it up, so it now becomes 9.6. Now if I want to create a full circle, I need to take my length, as I did here. I've divided it by the 3.14, and my answer is the answer to this, which was 9.6. Now I want to take that answer and divide that again now by 2, and that will give me the radius I need for a full circle. And in this case, it would be 4.8 centimetres. Again, I've rounded that up a little bit to make that easier to mark out. So this is the formula you need to apply to any flounce circles that you're going to create. So let's have a look at how we're going to mark those out. Now it's important to know where your straight of grain is. So this is my selvage edge, so I know the straight of grain is going down parallel to that. The best way to mark out any circle is to use a compass. But if, like me, you haven't got one, I'm going to show you how I mark them out. So what we're going to mark out, first of all, is by starting with the radius to mark out that inner circle of our flounce. So I'm going to put the point of my pattern master, and that's going to be the midpoint, that's the point, the start of my radius. And as I said, I'm going to first of all show you to mark out a full circle. So the radius for that, if you remember, was 4.8. So on my measurements here, from my dot, I'm going to mark out 4.8. Then I'm going to move my pattern master ever so slightly, making sure I'm still lining up with that first dot. And again, I'm going to put another mark on my 4.8. And so I'm going to continue that all the way round till I have marked out the whole circle. Now obviously this is going to take a little bit of time, but it is worth you taking that time and making sure that you are accurately marking your circle. the closer those markings you make will help you when you then line them up, as it were, and draw out your circle. So it's up to you how far apart you want to make them. Depends on how confident you are about drawing your circle when it comes to it. Once you've done that circle, I'm now going to draw that in. Now, if you're confident, you could just draw that freehand. So effectively, I'm lining up my dots and I'm drawing my circle. So there. So that's my inner circle complete. Now I need to add seam allowance to that because that's effectively the edge that we're going to sew onto our garment. And my centimetre seam allowance is what I need. So it's entirely up to you how you do that. I find, because that's quite a tight circle, that I find it easier to mark the centimetres with my tape measure. I find that a bit quicker, but it's entirely up to you how you do that. So I'm just going to go all the way around my circle, just filling in that 1 centimetre seam allowance. So I will know where that is when I come to cut this out. So that is my seam allowance marked. Now, the next thing I want to know is how deep I want my flounce to be. On the one that I showed you, my flounce was 8 centimetres deep. Okay, so I'm then going to mark my 8 centimetres from my flounce to give it its depth. So if that's 8 centimetres, then I'm also going to mark a centimetre after that, because that's going to be my seam allowance on the outside. Now, you can do this again either with your pattern master or with your tape measure. It's entirely up to you. But what you need to do is make sure you're always on the line correctly, so that that's all going to come out as even as possible. So there's my 8 and there's my 9 of my seam allowance. So keep going till you've got it all marked around the circle. Again, depending on how good you are at joining your dots, you can make as many marks or as little marks as you're confident in making. So that's now the markings for my outer circle, and I'm now going to line those up and draw that circle in. Now, again, I'm sure you'll be much more accurate than I'm being here, but as long as you can get that as a nice, round, even circle, then that's what you're after. So this effectively is our flounce now, and we're going to cut that out. Now what's important, as I said, was the grain line. And the grain line is where you need to cut through your flounce in order to cut it out. So you must correspond that to the grain. That's really important, because as we move it out, because the rest of the flounce more or less will be on the cross or of the grain, or the part that's the stretchiest in your fabric, that will help to create that flounce flare. So this is parallel to my salvage edge, so that's my initial cut through my flounce. Now I'm going to carefully cut around where my seam allowance is, because obviously I need that to sew this in place. That's the inner one done. Now I'm going to cut out the outer one. So again, I need my 1 centimetre seam allowance. So take your time and hopefully you will cut that out as evenly as you can. Now, that's my flounce, my full circle flounce now cut out. I actually cut mine two together so that I had two flounces. And the reason for that is if I wanted to make a longer flounce, then I would want to seam those two together, and that would give me an even longer flounce to work with. The best seam really to do, depending on your fabric, but a little French seam at this point would be the answer. You could do a fell seam, but that might be a bit bulky, depending on your fabric choice. You also, if you wanted to make double flounces, then you might want to create two, and maybe you would then reduce this one so it's shorter, and then you'd have a double flounce. So the options are quite varied. So now I'm going to show you how I would do the half circle. So again, do you remember we calculated using our formula for our half circle, which was just the length, which was 30 centimetres, divided by 3.4, and that gave me 9.6 centimetres. So that's going to be the radius now of my half circle. So because the half circle, it's like where we've cut through, that also needs to follow the straight of grain. So this is the line I'm going to have as my end line, if you like, for my half circle. And I'm going to mark my centre point, and that's where I'm going to radiate my radius from. So now I'm going to mark my 9.6, which is what I need to create this one. So again, take your time, mark that as evenly as you can. So just coming to the end now, down to my line, so make sure that my 9.6 is marked there. So that's my radius circle for this, and again I'm just going to draw my circle following my marks, and there we have it. So again, I want a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so I'm going to make sure I mark that as well. So depending on how much flare or fullness you wanted for your flounce would depend on whether you used full circles or half circles. So a half circle will not give you as much flare as the full will. Now again, that flounce depth was 8 centimetres, and so that again would be what I would mark. So I'd mark up to the line of my flounce, that's my 8, and my 1 centimetre I'm going to mark at the same time. So those are my two marks, and again, keeping that in line, I will mark that around. Okay, so that's now marked out, and again I need to draw that semicircle. I'm using my pen that disappears when I iron it, so that's not going to be an issue when I've finished. So now you'll just cut this one out. Now obviously if you need seam allowance here and here, we would also need that 1 centimetre seam allowance there. realise it's slightly easier, I'm just going to turn my fabric so that I can then cut out my inner circle. So again, I'm cutting out not on that line but on the 1 centimetre markings. Obviously you could draw those if you prefer, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so now we've created our half flounce and we have created our full circle, half circle, full circle. So the next section, we're now going to look at how to hem these, because it's easier to hem your flounces first before we insert them into the garment. Now we're going to look at how to hem the edge of our flounce. So it's much easier to do this now at this stage before we attach it to any garment. I'm going to show you 3 options or 3 alternatives if you like. The first one is that we could bias bind that hem. So either you can make your own bias binding or you can purchase it. Normally we use a 1 centimetre seam allowance binding, so that's where you'll cut your fabric on the cross or across the grain of the fabric if you like, so it's stretchy, that helps it go round corners, and then we fold it under 1 centimetre each side, and then that's folded in half, and that creates your 1 centimetre bias binding. And in order to just attach that to your flounce, you would pop it on the edge. So the edge of your seam allowance will go into the centre of your bias binding. Fold that over and just pin that in place. So you will continue to take that around the edge of the flounce. So this could be in the same fabric that you're making your flounce out of, or it might be that you want it to be a contrasting colour, so you've used a different fabric. So you would continue all the way round to the other side, and then when you sew that in place, I would just want to sew as close to the edge of my seam here where the bias binding sits, so that I just catch that nice and neatly in. So take your time so you can go around that edge nice and evenly. Now, I'm not doing the whole thing because I just want to demonstrate how to do it. But that would be a neat edge to your flounce if that was your choice. So obviously you would continue that all the way around. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing edging your flounce might be if you actually wanted to face it, and maybe you would want to face it with, again, a fabric that was contrasting. So again, I would prepare my piece that I'm going to put around the edge exactly as I would do for the bias binding. I would cut it so that I've cut across the grain of my fabric, and I've folded in my 1 centimetre on either side, but I haven't now folded it over like you would for your bias. I've left it like that. So to attach this, I would fold out that 1 centimetre, and I would be sewing on where that fold line was. So this effectively is the right side of the fabric to the right side of the fabric of the flounce. And again, you would just pin that all the way around. You don't have to have ironed under the 1 centimetre, but I do find it is much easier when you come to actually inserting it or sewing it onto the flounce. Just continue round. So just for ease of time, I'm just going to stop it there, but obviously you would continue all the way. And then we would sew that on that 1 centimetre seam allowance line. So take your time, make sure you're following the edges correctly. So now I'm theoretically at the end. So then, on that seam edge that you have just sewn, you would then turn that under. So that is now on the wrong side of your fabric. Again, if you want to, you could press that seam, if that helped you to get that nice and crisp, that edge where you're going to fold that under. That's entirely up to you. I'm going to change my pin at that point because I actually want to sew that way around. So you would make sure that folded all under nicely. And getting that as crisp as you can. How deep you wanted this facing to be is entirely up to you. Obviously, this particular one is 2 centimetres, and I had just under, actually 1 centimetre that was folded under. But it's entirely up to you what this would be. Once you've pinned that in place, I'm then going to sew that down. And again, I'm trying to go as close to the edge of my facing as I can, but making sure I'm catching it nicely. Because these are all cut on the cross or cut on the bias of the fabric, it means they go around the curves really nicely and you don't get any puckering. And that might look really nice with a contrasting fabric. Okay, so that is the edge of that flounce now faced. Okay, so that's another way you could do that. You could also put another little line of stitching just to make that really, really crisp if you wanted. That's entirely up to you. And the last way I want to show you is how I'd hemmed the example of the flounce I showed you at the beginning. So on this flounce, I just turned it under 0.5 and then turned it under again, and then I've top stitched it. and that's how I did that one. So here I have one already prepared. So I've turned under my 0.5 to the wrong side of the fabric, and I've ironed that all in place. I find that's much easier if you do that. And then I just can then turn it under the last bit of the 5.5 of the centimetre seam allowance. And again, you would need to pin that down in place. Take your time. You'll find that you just need to kind of pull it a little bit as you go, and that just helps that it will sit nice and flat and evenly. And you would continue that all the way around so that you would have that all pinned nicely like that. And then obviously I would sew that as close to the edge as I could, and then you will get that nice, neat edge to your flounce. So the choice is yours, but make sure that you get that done before we then put it into the button stand, and that's what we're going to look at. Now I'm going to show you how to attach the flounce to the button stand so that it follows the front of the shirt. Obviously you can put it in different parts of your shirt, it's entirely up to you, but the principle will pretty much be the same depending on where you put it. So for this particular one we need to use the button stand that we attach. So if you're going to have a flounce on both sides, you need this style of button stand for both sides, not the grown on and then the added on. They both need to be added on. You also will need to make sure that the button stand, the right side is against the shirt wrong side, so the inside of the shirt. Now I'm going to take my flounce and I'm going to attach my flounce to this side. But as you can see, because that circle is quite tight, I'm actually going to snip into my seam allowance to help me flatten that much easier. So I'm just going to make a series of snips all the way around that seam allowance. I'm not actually going up to the line of my seam allowance, but I'm just finishing just before it. And this will allow me to flatten out that edge and make it much easier to sew it in place. So once you've gone all the way around that inner circle, like so, now I will be able to stretch that a lot easier to go into that button stand. Now you need to put the right side of the flounce to the right side of the button stand. So once you've established and you know where you are, you can take that off there. That was just so you could see clearly where you're going to put it. And then I'm going to pin it in place onto my button stand. So continue that down. You see how that stretches out as we go. Once I've got that pinned in place and I'm happy where that is, I can now sew this. So take your time. Make sure that's staying nice and flat. You're keeping your edges together. And that is lying flat so you don't get any pleating. down, making sure that will line up nicely at the end there. And then just finishing it off backwards and forwards as usual. Just snip my ends. So now my flounce is attached to my button stand. I will now pin my button stand to my shirt front, as I normally would do. Okay, now I'm happy with that. I'm just going to take that off my mannequin so I can sew that in place. Again, it's a 1 centimetre seam allowance as usual. All the way to the end. Finish that off. Snip my threads as usual. So, obviously, if you're attaching flounces to your button stands, you would do that in conjunction with your button stands. So now I've got them both sides sewn. I need to press these. Now I'm going to press it so that that seam is going to press towards the button stand, and the same for the other seam. I'm going to press that also towards the button stand, and then that will just make it easier when I come to turn it over and sew it in place. So I'm going to iron that first. Now you can see I've pressed my seams so they will lie nice and flat. So now I'm going to turn over my button stand. So now this is the right side of my shirt. I can bring my sleeve through if you've got your sleeve on. And we're now working on the right side of the shirt. So I want that edge to roll and be nice and crisp, but I also want to make sure that that is tucked under that hem. So under there where we've ironed that down underneath, make sure that that is also tucked under. Now I'm going to pin that down by the flounce. So again, making sure that edge is nice and crisp and that my seam underneath is tucked under. So rolling that edge, making sure that's tucked under too. And then obviously I'll continue down the button stand. Okay, so we're going to sew as close to the edge as we can, but on the side of the button stand. Okay, so that's where our seam is going to go. you're happy that you're lined up, turn the machine on. Take your time, try and make that as straight as you possibly can. Keep checking everything is lying flat underneath. Always worth double checking underneath. All sorts of things happen when you're not aware of them. And once you're through the flounce, you'll just continue down your button stand. So there you have your flounce attached to the front of your shirt. Now obviously you could top stitch this edge as well, and that would make that nice and crisp. And there's a flounce for that front of shirt. Obviously you'd repeat that on the other side if you wanted flounces on both sides. And then here at the top, that will just line up, and then when we put the collar on, that will go into the collar, and that will just make that nice and neat. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an idea of how to make your flounces.